once I had enough background, about 20 years of experience, I put it together in a book called Libido Dominandi. And over the course of that book, I realized that every instance that I was dealing with was a form of control. Uh, the libido dominandi could also be considered a history of modern psychology. Uh, so it was Freudian psychology, it was behaviorism, and then it was third way. Each of those instances, they were all forms of control. Sigmund Freud used to try to get rich Americans, lure them onto the psychiatrist's couch so that he could extort money from them. The story of Horace Frink is a classic example of that. An American doctor who went over to become a psychoanalyst. During the course of his psychoanalysis, he mentioned that he was having an affair with one of his patients. Sigmund Freud at that point said, well, divorce your wife, marry this woman, and then make a large contribution to the Psychoanalytic Society. Obviously, behaviorism was always conceived as a form of control, of sort of technology. And the third way, Carl Rogers, that group of people, we pioneered that story, which was basically how Carl Rogers, after Vatican II, wrecked the Immaculate Heart nuns in Los Angeles as a way of renewing them using sensitivity group. So it all came together in the sexual realm with Libido Dominandi. And then around the same time, I wrote Slaughter of Cities, which is about social engineering. That term is actually used there. I'm the first guy who ever said that sexual liberation was a form of social engineering, but this is the social engineers themselves. In particular, Gunnar Myrdal, the big book he wrote or claimed to write, it was actually written by the psychological warfare establishment about racism. That was about the destruction of neighborhoods under the guise of urban renewal. I called it a form of ethnic cleansing. It's a story that is still struggling to get out. I just did a review of Ta-Nehisi Coates' latest book about the Obama years. He talks about Chicago, and he's clear he doesn't know a thing that he's talking about. He's still trying to apply the old, tired formula of white racism as the root of all evil. It doesn't apply in Chicago. It just doesn't apply. He doesn't know what he's talking about because the whole story of social engineering may be in this book, but it still hasn't gotten out into the mainstream of our culture. This finally, after maybe 10, 20 years after I wrote these books, I finally stumbled across Michel Foucault. And this is all that Michel Foucault was talking about, except that he got it exactly wrong. He got it the exact opposite way. So the fundamental issue with Michel Foucault, the biographical issue, was his epiphany, which he called his pact with the devil. That's his term. When he took LSD in Death Valley while he was teaching at Berkeley. And he came up with the formula, which is basically the formula for the New Left, which is still in existence today. It's the operating system of all of our universities, which is basically, if you give us sexual liberation, we won't criticize your economic system. I gave that talk in Berlin a little over a year ago, and it was my first attempt to try and apply this to Germany in light of what I experienced there during the 1970s when I was a teacher there at a German gymnasium. This was the era of the Baader-Meinhof insurrection, the Rote Armee Fraktion insurrection, and basically the authorities discovered that about 80% of the people would put up a member of the Baader-Meinhof gang, people between 18 and 30. They had a huge pool of sympathy there with these people, and they drained this swamp by flooding the country with pornography. This is at around the same time that they did it in Portugal, 1974, when Salazar died. Carlucci, what was his first name? I forget the guy's first name. Anyway, the CIA guy who was in charge of the operation in Portugal flooded that country with pornography. I've given talks all over the world about what the Israelis did to the Palestinians when they invaded Ramallah in 2002. So pretty much that is pretty much the summary of about 20 to 30 years of various research leading me to the conclusion that sexual liberation is a form of political control. And nothing that I've learned since that time has convinced me that I made a mistake when I made the statement first 20 years ago.
Very good summary, Professor. Libido Dominandi was a beautiful book. Many of us here spent a great deal of time reading it. I remember in the beginning you introduced the idea of control by the passions by means of talking about Augustine. Would you be able to briefly introduce the idea of oneself being controlled by one's passions so that everybody
Yeah, well,
can understand?
yeah, the mechanism was described pretty much by Saint Augustine in the City of God. He said, "A man has as many masters as he has vices."
In the City of
If
God,
you
you
look,
said?
yeah, his big book about the to defend the church against the charge that they were responsible for the fall of Rome. Uh, a man has as many masters as he has vices. The church had talked about the slavery of sin. It's in the Gospels. It's in that, but he codified it in a way. He did it in a philosophical way that pretty much stated the position fairly clearly. This was a revolution in consciousness because the ancient Greeks didn't have a lot to say about freedom. They really didn't talk about it a lot. They felt that people were slaves, phusei, which is to say by nature. There were certain people who were condemned to be slaves. Plato and Aristotle could not philosophize.
Let's reset a second. Professor, you roboted out for a moment. Can you start from where your last thought? Can we begin again?
I said that St. Augustine, by placing freedom in the realm of morality as a function of morality, created revolution in philosophical thinking because the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, felt that freedom was basically a function of your state in life, and you were a slave by nature. It didn't make much sense. I mean, you could be captured as sailing across the Mediterranean and turned into a galley slave, even if you're a prince. So it didn't make much sense. But they couldn't really think it through. But Augustine was the guy who thought it through. And then you had 1,000 years of meditation on Augustine. He was the main thinker that the Christian Europe thought about. And you had a whole sacramental system based on it, to the point of, by the time we get to the 18th century, the Jesuits had created a system of examination of conscience. Adam Weishaupt taught at a Jesuit university. It was the University of Ingolstadt in Bavaria. He basically took the understanding of Jesuit examination of conscience and turned it upside down, which is to say, originally you go to your spiritual advisor or your confessor and you say, "These are my sins." And he says, "Okay, go and sin no more." The Illuminati, and this is the name of the organization Weishaupt founded, turned it upside down. So instead of saying "go and sin no more," they say, "Well, we will give you a license for sin as long as you tell us what your sins are." At this point, Weishaupt called it Seelenanalyse. And if you translate that into Greek, it means psychoanalysis. And that's the term that Sigmund Freud used. And I am convinced that Sigmund Freud read the Illuminati manuscripts via Barruel. Because Barruel's book, The History of Jacobinism, Memoirs Toward the History of Jacobinism, was a underground bestseller throughout the 19th century. Byron and Shelley read it on their famous picnic in Switzerland. Everybody read this book. And as a result, the ideas that were the basis for Christian spirituality got turned on their head, and what was the instrument for liberation from the slavery of sin, namely confession, got turned upside down to a form of control based on the promotion of the vice that you were supposed to confess. And the best examples of these were, as I mentioned before, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, who had a contest, a sort of competition to see who could get the most rich Americans on the couch, on the psychiatrist's couch, to extort money from them. That's where it ended up. That was the basis of it. That was the mechanism, and that's how it became a form of political control.
Now, I know this audience would be especially interested in hearing about very particular uses of sexual liberation as forms of control, particularly pornography. I know that you use an illustration commonly about Israel and the Palestinians, and I'm sure they'd love to hear that, as well as any other interesting cases that you might want to expound on.
Well, yeah, I mean, the case of the Israelis, good, and I use it so often because it completely explodes everybody's notion of what pornography is. Now, if you want the conventional understanding of what pornography is, watch Boogie Nights or The People versus Larry Flint. These are two films that Hollywood produced right at the moment when the Congress was debating the Communications Decency Act. This was propaganda for pornography. Okay? Larry Flint in the trial says no one can be free unless I have the right to produce pornography. Okay? It's an essential, the sexualization of the culture is an essential point for controlling large numbers of people. This is also what I discovered during the time of the research for Libido Dominandi. I went to the Rockefeller archives. The Rockefellers were the main support for Alfred Kinsey. Alfred Kinsey started doing his research with Rockefeller money during the 1940s, during World War II, actually the late 30s, 1940s. He needed assistance, and there was a man from South Bend by the name of Wardell Pomeroy, who became one of his assistants. It's one of the co-authors of the Kinsey books. And he was going to get drafted. So he had to write a book to the local draft board here in South Bend. And in that draft, in that letter, he said that this is crucial research for the Rockefeller people, and because it explains, it is essential to understand how you can control large numbers of people. He actually said that to the draft board. They gave me that document when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation. I'm sorry, the Rockefeller Archives. That is one of the few explicit statements here about what was going on, but everyone knew it sort of intuitively, and the oligarchs at this point of time, led by the Rockefellers, who were kind of the leading family of the WASP elite, the kind of venture capitalist for the WASP elite's program of social engineering. They were the ones that promoted it. They were the ones that made sure that the default settings of the society got changed to allow this form of sexual liberation, because they knew that they controlled, by controlling the media, you could manipulate people's passions, and in manipulating people's passions, you control how they acted. It's that simple. It was just one more form of social engineering during the high noon of social engineering in the United States.
Recently, you've written on atheism as the Anglo ideology. How has this ideology come to dominate the world since World War II?
Well, there was a kind of intellectual craze about 10 years ago. It was called the New Atheism. And there were four guys basically who were responsible for it: Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, and Sam Harris. They all wrote books about atheism. If you look at the book, if you read the books, what you realize what they all have in common is Darwinism. And Darwinism is basically, I'd say, the philosophical foundation of the Anglo-American ideology. If I've said this before, but when my son went to Harvard, we didn't have a clue about what Harvard was about, but he actually went there because the crew coach made a pitch for him, and So yeah, why not row while you're studying? So they had a great crew team, so we went there and rowed. But what happens there is you get invited to join a club, and the clubs are the secret to what goes on at Harvard. It's like Skull and Bones is the elite club at Yale, and the Porcellian is the elite club at Harvard. So he gets invited to lunch, and the first question they asked him is, "What do you think of Darwin?" And he gave the wrong answer, and that ended his career as a budding master of the universe. You know, that was it. But it is the crucial, it is the ideology of the ruling class. It is the ideology, and it does lead. It is basically a justification for atheism. Darwin couldn't say that because he would have been run out of town on a rail in England in the middle of the 19th century when he wrote his book. But it's implicitly there. Basically, you have the universe is basically the self-regulating system. It's paganism. There's no question about it. It's a modern form of paganism. It got its start in England when with Newtonian physics, when Newton basically took Empedocles. Empedocles said that the world was composed of love and strife. And Newton was an alchemist. He was heavily involved in all of those experiments in his apartment. It probably drove him crazy because he was boiling lead in his apartment in beakers. So he went crazy for a while. But he took these terms. He knew he couldn't promote magic anymore. Magic was over. The John Dee form of magic that was popular under Elizabeth was over. So he changed the terms and he created science, modern science, by saying it was gravity and inertia. Adam Smith took that and he changed it, gave it an economic meaning by competition and self interest. It's the same, it's love and strife again. And then the final step was applying these ideas to biology. Biology then became a self contained system. It didn't need God. It was like Laplace when Napoleon asked him where God fit into his system. Laplace said, "Well, I don't need that hypothesis." Well, this was implicit, and over this period of time, basically what you realize, it became more and more overt, largely through the work of the Huxley family, who were Darwin's big promoters, until finally you reach the point in 10 years ago where they threw off any type of restraint, and we're just going to flat out tell you that God does not exist. And if you think he does, you're an idiot. That was pretty much the tenor of their argument. Of course, you can't prove a negative, so you can't prove that God doesn't exist. So there's a lot of browbeating that goes on here and a lot of sleight of hand. And that's what I exposed in this article, which appeared in the October issue of Culture Wars. So to cut to the chase, the only philosopher of the group, Daniel Dennett, makes a statement in this book of his about atheism. And he says, the universe created itself ex nihilo. And then he makes an even more preposterous statement, or out of something very small. Well, this exposes the whole preposterous nature of Darwinism. First of all, it purports to be biology. Okay, biology is not metaphysics, and here they're making these metaphysical cosmological statements that cannot be backed up by biology in any way, shape, or form. Okay, that means so what we're saying here is this is preposterous. First of all, let's get to the second statement. If it's something very small, Professor, it's still something. Okay, so you haven't explained how it came into existence because it's something's already there. Okay, if we take your first statement seriously, the universe created itself ex nihilo. Well, wait a minute. That means the universe had to exist before it existed. Now, can you explain that to me? Well, no, you can't because that's impossible. That is logically impossible. And so the whole foundation of Darwinian uh, cosmology collapses in self contradiction. It's completely bogus. It's completely fraudulent. So I feel as if I'm liberating everyone from a bad dream that has existed for like 100 years now. Okay, They try to get around it by saying, well, they're small increments. This is Dennett's, not Dennett, Dawkins' myth of Mount Improbable. Okay, well, you can get from just little steps. We have a billions of years out there, and you just take little steps, little steps. Well, no, you can't do that because every time you try, you're trying to, every time you make this argument, you're trying to get from nothing to something, and you can't get there from here. Okay, you can't get there by little steps, and that's your whole argument about atheism is predicated on something that won't get you there. Now, the point here is that when you're talking about beginnings, you have to talk about God because there's no other way to talk about a beginning if you're talking about a real beginning. They are always fudging the issue. Hitchens said, well, there were light sensitive cells that became the eye. Well, either it sees or it doesn't see. Okay. We're back at the same issue. If you really want to talk about how things begin, you have to get to the philosophical, the metaphysical argument, which is basically the argument about the uncaused cause and the unmoved mover, which is something they don't know about. That Dawkins tries to refute it, but you can't refute what you don't understand, and so he doesn't refute it. So basically, what is that argument? This is the argument. I was in India and I'm talking at a school in Delhi, and they're 15-year-olds. And I give a little talk, and then the teacher says, are there any questions? And boy stands up, 16-year-old stands up, and he says, can you prove the existence of God? And I said, yes, I can. I said, nothing comes from nothing. There is something. Therefore, there was never nothing. This something could not bring itself into existence because to do that, it would have to exist before it existed. That's impossible. That cannot happen. So therefore, something else had to bring it into existence. That something is what all men call God. That's the proof. That was what I said to the kid. Now, there is a slightly longer variation that I shouldn't go into. You could say that the universe was created by a demiurge, who was created by another demiurge, who was created by another demiurge. And you could say, okay, the Indians are familiar with this. Their cosmology is basically the semicircle of the earth sitting on the back of four elephants, and the four elephants are standing on a turtle. And the question is then, what's the turtle standing on? And the answer is, it's turtles all the way down. Type that into Google and you'll get a little description of that whole philosophical argument. Well, it can't be turtles all the way down. It can't be demiurges all the way down. It doesn't work, okay? Uh, Ed Fazer has written a book about this topic. He mentions the analogy of the freight train. The caboose is moving. Why is the caboose moving? The caboose is moving because it's attached to a boxcar and the boxcar is moving. Well, why is the boxcar moving? Well, it's because it's attached to another boxcar. Well, is it boxcars all the way down, just like turtles all the way down? No, because the boxcar cannot move itself. There has to be a locomotive at the end that has within it the principle of motion. At the end of all of this chain of contingent being, there has to be an absolute being, and that absolute being is known as God. But I mean, this is the long version, but it's the same story that I basically told to the Indian boy when I was in Delhi. That's the first chapter in my book, a book I'm going to be writing about called the History of Logos and the Logos of History. I'm saying this is the moment in world history where we have basically a global community hooked up through the internet that can say things like they speak a global language, which is called English, which is good at saying things like, how much does that cost? And I'll take 17 of. I'm saying that there is a deeper language out there, basically the philosophical tradition of the West, beginning with people like Anaxagoras, the pre-Socratics who came up with the idea of logos and nous as the fundamental principle of the universe. I'm saying in order to have a more sophisticated conversation with Iranians, with Indians, with anybody in the world, you need to have this philosophical foundation and this philosophical vocabulary. And that's why I'm hoping to do with this book.
Would you care to relate the situation of Anglo-atheism to what you've called the fundamental division in American society between Jews, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and Catholics?
Yes. This is based, that division is based on a sociological theory called the triple melting pot, which basically says that there is no one American. We have the myth of the melting pot, and actually during World War I, we had melting pot pageants put on by the CPI, which is the propaganda ministry at that time, where they put up a big pot in the middle of a baseball field, and people would march up wearing their ethnic clothing from wherever they came from, playing their ethnic instruments. They go into the pot, and then the band under the band shell would strike up the Star Spangled Banner, and they'd all march out wearing suits and bowler hats. That doesn't work. That's propaganda. That's not reality. The reality of the situation is that basically people come. This is formulated during the period of European immigration. Okay, uh, people come from all over the world, but primarily from Europe. And when they get here, after 3 generations, they form an ethnic group based on their religion. And so there are three ethnic groups based on 3 religions: Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. I didn't understand this really until I did a book on Medjugorje, which led me to study the history of Yugoslavia. And I realized America's Yugoslavia. It's basically 3 ethnic groups based on 3 religions. And the other angle is that they're always at war with each other. And this is something that I suddenly realized in the history of the United States, there has never been an American. It's always been one of a particular kind of group. And they're at war with each other. So this solved the problem because that I was having about understanding the motivation behind birth control. We all know that birth control is a form of uh, population control. It's a form of sexual liberation. It's a form of political control. If you introduce it into a culture, you weaken the culture. And if you're really good at it, you destroy the culture because people stop having kids completely. This is the crisis in Iran right now. They've had the biggest drop in fertility in birth control history, and I'm trying to talk to these people about pulling them out of that demographic tailspin. Okay, so why were the Rockefellers so interested in promoting birth control? Because they did it because they were involved in ethnic warfare. They represented the WASP ruling class when there actually was a WASP ruling class, and their main opponent, given the triple melting pot, were the Catholics. And the main characteristic of Catholics from the Rockefeller point of view is they did not use birth control. So they couldn't really say, okay, let's get the Catholics to use birth control. Now they did do this. They did organize secret conferences at Notre Dame to change the church's teaching on contraception. Father Hesburgh, the late president of Notre Dame, organized a personal meeting, personal audience between John D. Rockefeller III and Paul VI during the summer of 1965. And during that meeting, Rockefeller volunteered to write the birth control encyclical that the Pope eventually issued as Humanae Vitae. So he did try to change it. But in general, what you have to do is it's like television, it's broadcast. We're going to change the default settings of the entire culture, and that has collateral damage. And the collateral damage mainly was the WASP ruling class went out of existence because they were the first people to show up at the birth control clinic. That's the story of that. But I mean, it also allowed me to realize the only way you can make sense of this type of thing is if the United States is in a constant situation of ethnic warfare, which I think it is. So as I said my son went to Harvard. Why did my son go to Harvard? He's not from elite New England school. He lived in Indiana, which is not an elite place. I gave a talk once and I said the main criterion for getting into Harvard is existence. If you don't exist, you can't get into Harvard, and that's precisely what happened. The WASP ruling class failed to have children. The children failed to go to Harvard, and so there was a gap, and it had to be filled by somebody, and people like my son ended up there. The other main group that ended up at Harvard was the Jews. And the reason they ended up at Harvard is because a man by the name of Kaplan taught a tutoring course in Brooklyn, a prep course for the SATs. This is in Nicholas Lemon's book, The Big Test, if you want to read the whole story. But basically, Kaplan uh, um, had parties after his course, after the kids had taken their SATs, and the criterion for getting into the party was you had to give them one question. So by the time he'd given the course X number of times, he knew every single question on the SATs. The Jews who took his course all got perfect scores, 1600s, and they all got into Harvard. And this was part of the turning, the changing of the guard that took place over the 1970s when the WASP ruling class went into eclipse and it was replaced by a Jewish ruling class, which is the situation that we have today. Um, the crucial turning point, I would say, was 1978 when John D. Rockefeller III and Nelson Rockefeller died. This was also the moment with the beginning of the rise of the neoconservatives, which is a Jewish political movement, which basically took over our foreign policy in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. But that's a nutshell, in a short summary, I suppose, of the triple melting pot and where it came from and where it took us.
Would you like to make some remarks on the Jewish revolutionary spirit as it emerged in history and as it relates to our present situation living under a Jewish ruling class?
Yes. On a personal note, it was the war in Iraq, the neocon takeover of our foreign policy, that started me thinking that something's going on here. I was, polite people don't talk about Jews, but at this point, I thought this is outrageous. We are an adjunct of Israel. We're doing this for Israel's foreign policy. Other people felt this way. Walt and Mearsheimer around the same time came out with the Israel Lobby, their book about Jewish control of our foreign policy. So this was the old WASP elite, the CFR, the CFR crowd, the Harvard, trying to regain control over something that they had basically brought about themselves, because the whole social engineering thing, war on the Catholics, was basically an alliance between the WASP and the Jews, ganging up on the Catholics. Louis Wirth, the sociologist, the Jewish sociologist from the University of Chicago, was classic, a big player, one of the key players in this whole WASP Jewish alliance. So I'm confronted with an issue here. Okay, we have Irving Kristol, and so I'm trying to apply political categories to Irving Kristol, and I realize it doesn't work. Irving Kristol is a Trotskyite during the 1930s when he hangs out at Alcove B at the community college in New York, and now he's a conservative. Well, what is it? Is it Is it liberal? Is it conservative? Well, it finally occurred to me, no, it's Jewish. It's Jewish. The Jews have a commitment to revolutionary activity. Okay, and neoconservatism was a revolutionary political movement, every bit as much as Bolshevism was, different in form, but the same type of substance. And so I started thinking, well, where did this come from? And I realized that it was a theological issue, and it began at the foot of the cross, which is basically when the Jews rejected Jesus Christ as their Messiah. The Jews were God's chosen people. The Messiah came, and at this point, every Jew is confronted with the decision: do I accept the Messiah on his terms, or do I make him fit our criteria? It's going to be a powerful military leader. Well, the Jews by which I mean the organized Jewish people under the leadership of the Sanhedrin, rejected Jesus Christ. Does that mean that every Jew in Jerusalem rejected Jesus Christ? No. Does that mean that the Blessed Mother and St. John yelled, "Crucify him"? No. It doesn't mean that every Jew did, but it means that the Jews did as an organized political entity. When they rejected Christ, they rejected the Logos incarnate. When you reject Logos, you're rejecting not just God, you're rejecting the order of the universe, which is reflective of the mind of God, which means you're rejecting the social order. And when you reject the social order, you become a revolutionary. And that's what the Jews have been ever since they rejected Jesus Christ. And that is the thesis of the Jewish revolutionary spirit.
You recently made certain remarks about Harvey Weinstein as a scapegoat messiah, especially with respect to sex. Tell me, what's the point of all this stuff in Hollywood?
Well, I was, like everyone else, I read the New York Times article exposing Harvey Weinstein, and for the life of me, it just didn't make sense. It's this feminist narrative where this innocent girl from Ohio walks into the hotel room to discuss script revisions, and Harvey propositions her. And she, at that point, smacks him in the face and turns around and walks out. And Harvey shouts behind her, "You'll never work in this town again." So I began to feel sorry for Harvey. He's the only guy who can't get laid. But it turns out that that's a different story. Okay, so then the New Yorker article came out, and they list all these ladies, the names, and so I started doing research into ladies like Rose McGowan, and it turns out they all do sex tapes. So what's going on here? What I'm saying here is that this is a moral panic. Basically, what you have here is this guilt and self-loathing because of the behavior that they've been involved in. I'm talking about the actresses now, because of what you have to do to become a star in Hollywood. The guilt and self-loathing built up to the point where it exploded in this incident of moral panic. And Hollywood is feeling vulnerable at this point. Their box office, it's terrible. They're losing out to television once again, which is what happened to them in the 50s. And they panicked. They panicked at everyone. So everyone is now rushing to denounce Harvey Weinstein. Uh, that's what's going on. I think that's the underlying. But then I began to think, well, is it just Harvey Weinstein? I mean, that's the message. It was like one guy who did this, but then suddenly everybody's being denounced. It's getting out of control. Kevin Spacey was just denounced as a homosexual. He came out as a homosexual to try and uh, absolve himself from the charges of sexual harassment. Uh, these people are they're part of a group. It's not an individual. It's not like a lone gunman. I don't believe that story either. They're part of a group. Well, what group are they part of? Well, to find that out, we go. Turns out that Harvey Weinstein was given the Humanitarian of the Year award by the Simon Wiesenthal Center in 2015. In his acceptance speech, he says we have to learn to act more like the mafia, and we have to go out and kick the anti-Semites' ass. That's a direct quote. Well, it turns out he's a part of a group. He's a Jew. And it turns out that the Jews run Hollywood. And it turns out that now what they're doing is engaging in classic Jewish behavior of the sort that they used to do in the temple before Jesus Christ arrived. In other words, they're finding a scapegoat. They're trying to download all of this guilt, all of this bad feeling because of what's been going on for so long. I mean, from the beginning in Hollywood. And they're trying to download it on one guy and expel him, kill him. That's what the scapegoat does. You kill the scapegoat, he's got all your sins on it, and now you're free of sin. Well, it didn't work then, and it's not going to work now. What you're seeing in Hollywood with people like Steven Spielberg expels him from the Academy that gives out the Academy Awards. Well, this is an act of desperation. You're trying to save a corrupt operation by trying to pin the blame on one man. And once you open that box, it's gotten out of control. The denunciations just come every day. Somebody else is being denounced for this type of thing. So I'm saying here, you can't understand this unless you can use Jewish vocabulary. And that's the whole point of every. Why I'm known in some circles as an anti-Semite. I am not an anti-Semite. I just don't. Just doesn't fit according to the classical definition. It's a form of racism. I don't believe it. But it means now someone the Jews don't like. Why don't the Jews like me? Well, because I criticized them, and you're not allowed to criticize the Jews, and that means you're not allowed to use the proper vocabulary. And the proper vocabulary in this instance, it revolves around one word. You talked about logos, very powerful word. The vocabulary, the word you have to use here is shiksa. You can't understand the Harvey Weinstein story unless you know what a shiksa is. A shiksa is the derogatory Yiddish term for a Gentile woman. Now, if anyone familiar with the writings of Philip Roth, like Portnoy's Complaint, know that Jewish men are obsessed with shiksas. Don't take it from me. Take it from Philip Roth. Read Portnoy's Complaint. I think Harvey Weinstein read Portnoy's Complaint. I can't imagine him not reading Portnoy. If I read it, I'm sure Harvey Weinstein read it when it came out. It was a very popular book. And once you get into this, you realize, well, wait a minute. This is something that Jews do. I can't imagine I can't imagine taking anybody, any Jew, not even Rabbi Marvin denounced Harvey after Harvey gave him $100,000 for his Humanitarian of the Year award. Is it a sin, Rabbi, to shtup the shiksa? Well, no, I don't think it is. I think this is considered virtuous behavior on the part of a Jew. So why are you blaming a Jew for doing what the Jew considers virtuous? Now, why do I say that's an awful thing to say? Okay, well, I say it because I've read Philip Roth, and if you want proof, you should read Philip Roth. Okay, but I also say it because it's time that we got honest about what the Jews believe. The Jews believe that hate is a virtue. Don't take my word for it. It's Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik who wrote this in First Things, which is a neocon magazine. So it must be true. Okay? This is what they say. Okay? I'm saying that basically this is the moral panic is because of what happened in Hollywood, because the place is corrupt from top to bottom because of the people who run it and what they believe. You can't exercise this by taking Harvey Weinstein out and shooting him. That's not going to solve the problem. And what is the problem? To understand it in its full dimensions, you have to go back to the time when when the problem was solved. And the people who solved the problem were the Catholics in the United States, the Catholic bishops who created an organization called the Legion of Decency and then organized a boycott of Warner Brothers theaters in Philadelphia in 1933 when they were hurting for money because of the Depression. The Hollywood moguls, signed the production code, and for 31 years, the Catholics kept the Jews under control. The Jews broke the code in 1965 with the movie The Pawnbroker, and the result is Harvey Weinstein and a lot of other stuff, a lot of bad other stuff too. But the point here is that the only guy in this story who understood the Jews was Joe Breen, the Catholic who got appointed head of the production code. And he wrote a letter in which he said, these people are the scum of the earth. Okay. And there were people who tried to pin the label of anti Semite on him for that, but it didn't stick. And he said, these are Eastern European Jews who think about nothing but sex and making money. And he said, and this is the punchline here, the film fare for the entire nation should not be left in the hands of people like this. That's the moral of the story. That's the lesson we need to derive from the Harvey Weinstein incident.
Professor, we're hitting about 45 minutes. I think it would be ideal if we went ahead and went to audience questions. You ready for that?
Yeah, I'm ready for it.
All right. Let's see. I've got one. I don't know how much expertise you have in this, but it's a question that's interesting to me as well. Um, One member asks, my question is, what do you think about the accusations that Catholicism integrated a lot of pagan practices and elements in order to appeal to the Gentiles more? Is this a fabrication? Is there truth to it? And if so, do certain pagan philosophies have a place in the formation of contemporary Catholic thinking as a consequence?
Yes. The answer is yes to all of those questions. And the best example I can come up with is Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. And the point of the book that I'm writing here is that logos is a Greek word that came into existence 600 years before Jesus Christ. Okay. This word was used in the first three sentences of St. John's Gospel. That means that he absorbed what this person, the person who just asked this question, this is an absorption of what they're calling pagan philosophy. I don't really see that as a productive term here. I'm saying logos, the idea of logos came into being not because of Christ. It came into being because of God the Father who created the universe according to logos. And this is precisely the statement that St. John makes at the beginning of his gospel. Ein arche, ein ha logos. In the beginning, there was logos. Now, I read that it's translated in English usually, in the beginning, there was the word. And I could not, for the life of me, figure out what that meant until I studied Greek and learned that the word logos has about 5 pages of definitions to it. Okay, so there was an orderly creation here at the beginning. From the beginning, there was never nothing because God was the logos. And that is exactly the third sentence. Kai logos ein theos. Or was it kai theos ein logos? Anyway, and logos is God. So what I'm trying to do here with this book is to obliterate this distinction that got made here, that this person made. Now, I understand what you're saying. You know, Aristotle was not a Christian, but he was a man who was instrumental in the refining of that term logos that was a crucial preparation for the gospel when St. John finally wrote it. And I'm saying this is the new perspective that I'm trying to come up with here, because from God's mind, it's just logos. You know, we see pagan, we see faith, we see reason. From God's mind, it's logos. And that's the perspective I'm trying to use in writing this book.
It was kai theos en o logos.
Right.
Another member asks, in regards to your stance on psychology, do you think that psychiatry is a more legitimate field, or is it also a method of control? Is it more or less insidious, in your opinion? I think he means contemporary.
If you're talking about Freudian psychology, Jewish psychiatry, yes, it's a form of control. If you're saying, if you're asking me, can there be a legitimate psychiatry? I'm saying yes. And all you have to do is go back to the root that Freud perverted, or that Weishaupt perverted, namely the implicit psychoanalysis that is in something like the Jesuit examination of conscience.
Confessional and self-reflection. Then,
Right. I'm saying that if you go back to the root, you can develop a legitimate psychiatry. To give you one example of a guy who did it was Joe Nicolosi, the late Joe Nicolosi, who created reparative therapy, which is basically allowing homosexuals to overcome their neurosis of father deprivation through talking about it, through identifying with the therapist as a kind of pseudo father, a non-sexual father. So I think it is happening. It is happening. It has happened.
another member asks, if the Jews are using the intelligentsia or the media to control society's zeitgeist for the sake of revolution, would the Christian desecularization of North America mitigate this, or is there something else that would be more effective?
Um, it's concretely speaking, I went to Iran. I was there in Tehran. Got interviewed by the New York Times. The New York Times reporter said to me, How would you characterize Iranian culture? What's your impression?" I said, "Desexualization." I said the Iranian Revolution put sex back in the private sphere where it belongs. I think something along those lines would have to happen in our culture. We have to have a desexualization of the culture. And the only way we can do that is by identifying the sexualizers, namely the Jews, who are responsible for Hollywood, who are responsible for pornography, who are responsible for gay marriage. Again, this is not me. This is Amy Dean in Tikkun magazine. When I say it, I'm called an anti-Semite. But these are the people who are responsible for it, and we have to hold them responsible in a even more explicit way than the Catholic Church did in 1933 when they instituted the production code. Those letters from Joe Breen were all private. Then none of them got made public, so the term Jew never got out into the public. In other words, we need to return to the traditional teaching of the Church, which is sicut Judaeus non, which is basically the Jew. No one has the right to harm the Jew, but the Jew has no right to destroy your culture through moral subversion. The problem right now is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is living in a fantasy world, has been living in a fantasy world for the past 50 years, and fantasized that it has no enemies. The Jews are our elder brothers. The Jews are not our enemies. The Jews are our enemies. Okay? This is not me again. This is St. Paul. 1 Thessalonians 2. The Jews are the people who created the Jews are the people who killed Christ, and they are enemies of the entire human race. They became enemies when they attacked, when they killed the Logos, when they became revolutionaries. That's what they've been. We have to come to some type of public awareness of this. And once we come to this public awareness, we have to start saying, no, you can't do this anymore. We can't allow you to corrupt the culture in the way you've done, which is coming out now in the whole Harvey Weinstein thing. Okay, we can't allow this to go on anymore. You're going to have to pull back. You're going to have to step back. We have to clean up the culture in one way or the other. An example of where this happened is in Poland, as I mentioned in the bio. The Polish translation of Libido Dominandi came out 1 month before the Polish bishop's pastoral on gender ideology. It Libido Dominandi had influenced the pastoral even before that through the writings of Gabriela Kubi, a German lady, who had taken my stuff and put it in her book. I was in Argentina among a people, conservative Catholics who were falling into despair. I got an email from Poland at just the right time for the man I was staying with at this point. And the email said to me, basically, between your book and the Polish bishop's statement, gender ideology has been obliterated in Poland. Now that wasn't me. That was this guy from Poland saying that. That's the formula for collaboration. The right idea, namely sexual liberation as a form of political control, combined with an organization that can put it into effect in some way or other, namely the Catholic Church. That's the formula for success. The Catholic Church is going to have to get over its crazy idea about Jews as their elder brothers and get back to the traditional teaching, which is that they are enemies of the entire human race, and start taking concrete steps that the Legion of Decency was, and Deus Non was as well.
Professor, we have time for one or two more questions. One person asks very simply, what do you think about Pope Francis and his sometimes controversial papacy?
That's too. It's too complicated to answer. Go buy my book on Kindle. It's called Saint France. I'm sorry, Pope Francis in Context. It's a Kindle book. It's a really complicated question, and I'm not going to get into it right now.
I understand. I understand. Um, Another asks about, I suppose, compromise. He asks, when it comes to beliefs, whether ideology, religious beliefs, or of any other commonly held ideas, there's a clash. Do you think that compromise, to have to splice two different factions' belief, is ever a viable option to resolve conflict?
Compromise is necessary in the political sphere. Okay, if you want to pass a bill in Congress, and you got to compromise to get the votes. Okay, it's not appropriate in the philosophical realm, and certainly not in the metaphysical realm. There's no the whole point of what I'm trying to say here. What is the point of this thing I wrote on atheism? Okay, I'm saying the point of this is that the existence of God is not an article of faith. It's an act of reason. This means that atheism is irrational. Now, you can be irrational, okay? I can't force you to be rational, but in order to deal with you, then I have to go to the realm of psychology. We're out of the realm of metaphysics or ontology. We're in the realm of psychology, and I have to basically ask you to lie down on the couch and tell me about your relationship with your father, okay? What I'm trying to say is that we now have a ground floor, a firm metaphysical foundation, which cannot be compromised. It either is or it is not the case. If it is the case that God exists and he created the universe according to a plan, we have to understand what the plan is, because that's the only way we're going to be successful or happy in this world. So in that regard, no, compromise is not possible. It's it's not possible.
One last question. Are there any current political figures in office or not that you have a particular respect for?
Uh, the the supreme leader in Iran issued a statement in 2010 apologizing for the fact that he introduced birth control into Iran. He said it was the biggest mistake of his life, and he begged Allah for forgiveness. Now, I think that that is a man of, I don't know whether you consider him a political leader or not, but that is a man whose stature is head and shoulders above anybody uh, that I can think of alive in the world today. I can think of no political figure who would say in public that he made a mistake and ask God for forgiveness for the mistake that he made.
Professor, I think we're coming in at a bit over an hour. Uh, I'm sure that you're at your endurance. Uh, I appreciate your time here. Are there any remarks you'd like to leave us with?
No, I think we've covered a lot, you know, and as I said, hallucinating and saying crazy things. So I think we should leave it at that. I've enjoyed the discussion, and I hope everybody else enjoyed it as well.
All right, I'm going to move you down to the. This concludes the interview, by the way. Everybody, if anybody needs to go or do whatever, Professor, I'm going to move you down a channel for just a little bit. To say thanks, and for the staff to say thanks
Okay.
to you, and then
Okay.
We can conclude.
Okay.
All right.
First thing I come back to.
What's going on up there? Why is there so many people in that?
Because people are blaming the Jews.
What happened?
They had some no name in there.
Wait, they have a what?
They have a no name
There
in
was-
there.
I don't
There
get it.
was an
What's
interview.
an interview for who?
Terry
There
Davis.
was
Terry Banks was up there?
I said Terry Davis.
Who the fuck is Terry Davis?
You don't know who Terry Davis is?
I really don't.
You have to know who Terry Davis is.
I listened to the very
Yeah, you're not
start.
a true peer.
I feel complete. I listened to the beginning, I listened
Terry
to the
Davis.
end.
He made the temple. He made the third